Details about the Manson family's ranch are leaving people deeply unsettled. Even before 1969, nearly everybody in the United States had seen Spahn Ranch, though they might not have known it by name. The Los Angeles farm was a favorite setting of TV and movie westerns for many years, but after it fell out of favor with Hollywood studios, something far more sinister than tumbleweeds rolled into town. Charles Manson and his band of crazed followers took over, and right from the start there was trouble. Donald Shea didn't mind the newcomers at first. Known as Shorty by his friends, despite the fact that he was 6'4", Shea was a hand at Spahn Ranch who also dabbled in acting, usually as a stuntman. Shorty was used to hanging out around all sorts of oddballs and weirdos, but he began to feel the Manson family was a bit more sinister. The ranch hand would have gladly kicked them out if he had the authority, but the property's owner had other ideas. George Spahn was 81 years old and could barely see Charles Manson when they first met, but he still fell for the man's magic charisma. Manson offered up his dozens of followers to do chores around the ranch and even sent a girl to visit George's bedroom from time to time. How, Shorty, had it come to this? Just a few years prior, big stars and high-powered directors passed through the ranch on a daily basis. Its 500 acres of quaint wooden buildings and rugged hills made it ideal for Western productions. George Spahn bought it in 1953, and as it became more of a showbiz hotspot, he expanded it to be a tourist destination too. Hit television shows like The Long Ranger and Bonanza filmed there regularly, and the ranch staff gave tours and horseback riding lessons to excited guests. Spahn's little kingdom made a tidy profit year after year, but when the 1960s rolled around, all that money dried up at once. Not only were westerns falling out of favor, but the property itself was decaying. One of the last projects to film at Spahn was the horror movie The Creeping Terror, but a much scarier scene would arrive in 1968 with the Manson family. They took over Spahn Ranch in a way that didn't sit well with Shorty. Susan Sadie Atkins identified the largely vacant ranch as a perfect communal home. Many of them had been living with the Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, but they got the boot after the musician moved. Spahn's residence kept them out of the public eye, and its connections to show business were particularly alluring, given that Manson aspired to become a world-famous musician. Chasing away the few tourists who still wanted to visit, Manson isolated his followers from the outside world. Living under communal rules, these free spirits were strong-armed into participating in orgies and indulging in mind-altering substances. Manson scholar James Buddy Day said, "There were no books, clocks, or calendars. They became increasingly reliant on each other, which enabled their eventual feelings of paranoia and fear, and the hippies showed that they were no peace-loving folk." The family often flirted with the idea of violence. Channeling the energy of the Hollywood productions that once shot on the ranch, they'd pretend to be cowboys or Indians or pirates for a day at a time. That was harmless enough, but Shorty soon noticed the hippies were also carrying out drug deals on the property. They also became increasingly hostile towards outsiders. The first real sign of trouble came when Shorty, still trying to keep the peace at the time, introduced Spahn crew to his new bride, Magdalene Stokes. For Manson, that was a major problem because Magdalene was black. His views on race relations were less than typical. Manson believed that the United States was headed for a massive race war called the Helter Skelter after the Beatles song, and he acted as if bringing Magdalene to the ranch was like inviting an enemy agent into their midst. Shorty couldn't believe it. He'd heard Charles go off on bizarre political tirades before, but to verbally harass his new spouse was unforgivable. The confrontation simmered down after both parties exchanged harsh words. Shorty would have complained to his boss, but the Manson family had practically become the old man's caretakers. Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who later attempted to assassinate Gerald Ford, was charged with caring for George Spahn, in addition to entertaining him from time to time. The ranch owner wouldn't kick out the hippies without a good reason. By 1969, Spahn was in big enough financial hole that he had to sell off much of his property. A neighbor named Frank Retz offered to buy a sizable portion on one condition: none of the Manson followers or their so-called guru were allowed on the land. Retz signed the initial paperwork and hired Shorty as his night watchman, which meant he was responsible for keeping the hippies in line. As the Manson followers huddled into the reduced Spahn property, their leader only became more convinced Shorty was the enemy. Tensions ran high as Charles did his best to psych out Shorty. As the watchman made his rounds, Manson resorted to menacing, if somewhat childish, behavior. For instance, he'd whisper strange threats and punch at Shorty's face, only to stop a few inches short. Shorty kept his cool. He thought Manson was all bark and no bite, but by the summer, the commune had gotten even more skittish than usual. Rumor had it that a drug deal gone wrong had resulted in the Mansons going to war with the Black Panthers, the first step in Helter Skelter. Charles had his people fortify the ramshackle buildings and start carrying weapons. Shorty didn't like that one bit. He was fairly certain Manson was also sending trusted members with Tex Watson to commit robberies in the area. With that in mind, he advised employees and neighbors of Spahn Ranch to stop lending out their cars to the criminals. When the vehicle owners refused, however, the hippies didn't take no for an answer. When the wife of one ranch hand refused to fork over her car keys, Manson and his followers beat her. Shorty blew a fuse when he found out, and he only became more convinced the commune had to go. That August, it seemed like his problem might have solved itself when police sirens blared down the branch's driveway. Manson hated cops, so he was curious when they questioned him about car thefts in the area. Things only got worse when the police returned shortly thereafter to bust Charlie for possession of marijuana. A short prison stint might have saved a number of lives, but a technicality put the cult leader back out on the streets a couple days later. As far as Manson was concerned, Shorty had become public enemy number one. Allegedly, Watchman was gleeful at the prospect of Spahn selling off the rest of his land. "It's all over for you, Charlie, when the new owners take over," Charles later quoted him. Even worse, the hippies believed that Shorty was a snitch and had called the cops himself. On the morning of August 26, Manson gave his lackeys Clem Grogan and Bruce Davis very clear instructions. They then asked Shorty for a lift into town so he could visit a mechanic's shop. He agreed. Perhaps the hippies were finally getting ready to clear out the ranch. Shorty didn't come home that night. If he'd known about the heinous deeds the Manson followers had committed in the previous weeks, Shorty never would have gotten into the car with the two men. In July, the hippies broke into the home of Gary Hinman, a musical virtuoso and good friend of Charles. Believing he had a vast inheritance stashed away, they stabbed him to death, trashed his home, and framed the Black Panthers for the deed, and that was only the beginning. Though it's doubtful he recognized Manson as the mastermind, Shorty had certainly heard of the murders on Celio and Waverly Drives that August. It wasn't just that movie star Sharon Tate was among the 7 victims, the killings themselves are brutal. The murderers stuck silverware into the corpses and scrawled messages across the walls in blood. For weeks, investigators had no clue who carried out these grisly murders, which only made them more of a media sensation. One Manson devotee, Bobby Beausoleil, had been apprehended for the death of Gary Hinman, but police didn't believe any of these crimes were linked at the time, and they never heard about Shorty's disappearance either. Neither George Spahn nor Frank Retz realized their ranch hand was missing, and none of the Manson family ever mentioned it. They were preparing to mobilize for the next stage of their apocalyptic race war and fled Spahn Ranch. Though through sheer chance, they were finally connected to the high-profile LA murders. Most of Manson's group was arrested for a string of vehicle thefts in the following months, though the police didn't dream they had a band of murderous hippies on their hands. It was only after Susan Atkins' cellmate blabbed about her role in the killings that they treated Manson as a serious suspect. They were appalled by what followed. It wasn't just the lurid details of the Manson group's crimes. The trial itself was a spectacle. Even after Linda Kasabian flipped on the other followers in exchange for immunity, Manson stirred up trouble. He had his people give out conflicting information under oath. He claimed to be the devil and tried to attack the judge at one point. Then accusations emerged that Manson had killed even more innocents. Shorty's wife Magdalene, though separated from him at the time, grew worried when her husband disappeared. A few Manson stragglers at Spahn Ranch said he'd gone to San Francisco, but that didn't add up. Magdalene contacted the police, and when they learned of Manson's vendetta against Shorty, the ranch hand became a key figure in another trial in 1971. Grogan and Davis clearly never made it to the auto shop with Shorty, so they spilled the beans. Manson wanted them to get the watchmen to pull over at a remote section of the ranch. There they would bash him in the head with a pipe wrench, but that plan didn't go as expected. The blow only dazed him. Manson and Tex Watson soon showed up, and the 4 men gagged up on the half-conscious Shorty. They repeatedly slashed at him with knives, and Davis stuck him with a bayonet. Manson also wanted to cut off his head, but his followers pointed out their victim was already dead. The defendants shared where they'd buried their remains, and the police sped off to locate them. But there was no trace of Shorty's body. Was this just another of Manson's smokescreens, a charade decided to make the police look foolish? It's true the accused murderer's accounts didn't quite line up. Rumors persisted that Shorty had been cut into 9 separate pieces and scattered across LA. To make matters worse, plenty of evidence had been destroyed. In 1970, a fire swept through Spahn Ranch and took down every building. George Spahn clung to life for a few more years before passing in 1975. He never learned what happened to his loyal ranch hand, but the ultimate truth would make itself known soon enough. In 1977, Grogan provided investigators with a detailed map of where they killed and buried Shorty. What was left of him was finally located at December in Spahn Ranch. He'd been loyal to the end, but what happened to the burnt-out remains of the ranch? Today, it's nothing. Various business ventures, including a tourist center and Christian daycare, attempted to develop the land, but the efforts fell through. The state eventually took ownership of the former Spahn Ranch, and you can actually visit the site. The land has been incorporated into Santa Susana Pass State Historic Park. Hikers can enjoy the fresh air and stunning mountain views, but there's no trace of the violence and lunacy that took place decades earlier. Perhaps Shorty has finally found peace. Only a few bits of graffiti hint that the Manson legend lives on. Tex Watson and Bruce Davis are still incarcerated to this day. The egomaniacal Manson died in prison in 2017. Clem Grogan actually managed to earn parole after cooperating with the search for Shorty's body, and he's retreated to a quiet life ever since. The grieving Magdalene Shea passed away in 2001. Did you enjoy today's story? Let us know what you think about it in the comments. If you believe this story was amazing, don't hesitate to share it with your buddies, hit the subscribe button, and activate the notification bell so you'll never miss your daily dose of incredible stories.